Hello and welcome to Creativity Uncovered. My name is Abby Gatling and I'm on a journey to uncover how everyday people find inspiration, get inventive, and open their imagination. I basically want to find out how people use creativity at home, at work, at play, and everything in between. And my goal for this podcast is that by the end of it, you'll be armed with a whole suite of tried and tested ways for you to be able to summon creativity the next time that you need it. Joining me today on the podcast is Dr. Marion Piper. And I'm very, very excited to speak to Marion because I actually saw her present at a design summit a couple of months ago, and I just had to reach out. And that's the great thing about this podcast is just that I get to pick the brains of people who are inspiring. And that's exactly what I'm planning to do today. So welcome, Marion.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. And that was the Designer Boss Summit, which if people aren't aware of it, it's an absolute riot. I had such a good time. And kudos to you for reaching out. I think in today's hyper-connected world, it can be really intimidating to reach out to people or sort of, preemptively think that that they wouldn't want to do it. But I've also found in my journey that the times that I reach out and, want to collaborate with people, it's received usually pretty warmly. So I love the position where we're starting this conversation from.
That's it. I'm trying to act on my sparks of curiosity a bit more intentionally. And so, when I was watching that and there were a bunch of other really great presenters as well, I was like, I would like to know more about this. So I'm just going to YOLO and do it. So I appreciate you saying yes.
I YOLO'd to your YOLO.
Yes, YOLO squared. That was good. So I'm super keen to jump into our conversation. I have so many questions for you. And there's so many things that I want to talk to you about. Hopefully we can get through it all. But what caught my eye in the summit a couple of months ago was you had the session about pushing through creative blocks and supercharging your creative process. And I'm sure you're going to share lots of great tips throughout this conversation. But I actually would like to start with something else that you mentioned in your presentation. And that was about your PhD in creativity and post-traumatic growth. Because I know there has to be a story behind that. That is a really interesting combination. So why don't we start there? Tell me a bit more about your PhD. How did you get there? And how did you choose that topic?
Oh, man. Talk about opening Pandora's box from the start. I love this. Oh, gosh. The PhD was one of the most incredibly personal and growth-fueled journeys that I've ever had the absolute honor of doing. A lot of people think that a PhD is this incredibly heady, very analytical, very numbers-based experience, which for a lot of people it is. But for me, it was very much a journey of catharsis, and it was it kind of coincided serendipitously with a lot of other things that were happening in my life at the time, almost in a chicken or the egg kind of scenario. Did I do the PhD because it was going to be the life raft that I could cling to survive the things that were happening in my personal life? Or did things happen in my personal life that then created the need for that exploration? So, and this is something that I'm really curious to investigate myself. And have been doing in some way, shape, or form my entire life, is just trying to understand trauma, why things happen to us, and what happens to us as a result of the things that we experience. And so it was a really bizarre series of events that led to that PhD. I'd been living abroad. I was traveling. I just finished my master's, and my high school art teacher, shout out to Lexi Lassick, she reached out to me seeing that I finished my master's and said, hey, do you want to come and do a PhD with me? I was like, no, I've just done 1,000 years at university.
I'm done. Yeah.
I'm done. But then she said, whispered that, that magic phrase of you can do whatever you want. And that really tapped into one of my core values, which is freedom. I started, this is the beautiful thing with PhD projects, particularly ones that are more creatively fueled. And mine was 60% creative practice, 40% research. And so you start at the biggest possible, widest point of the funnel. And just over the years, you just narrow until you end up at this place that sounds almost too simple to be a research project, right? Because that's it. Like, wisdom is simple. Anything that's overcomplicated hasn't been distilled enough. So what I was really interested in was not so much, the bad things that happen to us after trauma, like, we might experience PTSD, we might fall apart, we might, take that downward spiral as a result of what we've been through. I was more interested with the upwards tick, what I call the spiral up. So what is that process like? What kickstarts it? Is there ways that we can encourage it? And that's where I really discovered the term post-traumatic growth, which comes out of positive psychology. These two researchers in the US, Tedeschi and Calhoun, really spearheaded the journey. There's been other researchers over the last sort of 10 to 15 years that have looked into lots of other things, like people who survive natural disasters, significant physical injuries, or experiences like breast cancer or losing a limb. But psychologically speaking, and from a creative lens, it's like, well, okay, like how do we process? How do we deal with the stuff that happens to us? And in my personal experience, the thing that saved me over and over and over again is creativity. It is the one thing that no matter what I go through, if I dip into that process, it always helps. Like, there is no negative, at least what I've found, there's no negative consequence to experiencing the creative process, except the fact that, you might change your life. You might decide to completely upend everything. You might discover something new about yourself. So I went into that project. I kind of went into that project thinking that I would be exploring that in an external way. So I was really looking at resilience in teenagers is where I kind of started, because I knew that time of life is really significant, and at that point there wasn't a huge amount of research done, and I was in an arts education faculty, so we were looking more through it from an educational lens rather than a psychological one. But then as I sort of started to do the research, I started to see myself in the research. And that's when I really lent in and, was like, okay, this is the time for me to really explore what I went through as a kid. Because also from an advocacy perspective, there really wasn't a lot of arts-based research that talked about what all this stuff feels like. There's so many clinical trials done or research projects by the numbers that sort of explain, X percentage of people experience post-traumatic growth, or like these are the traits that people have that are more likely to experience post-traumatic growth. But there really wasn't a lot from a narrative perspective or a creative perspective that actually showed you or gave you an inside look into what this stuff feels like. And, one of the things that I love most about the creative process is it gives us a through line to self-expression. It allows us to take something that's inside of us that it begins as a feeling, or it might begin as a thought, but moves as it becomes a feeling, and translate that into something that someone else might understand. And so this process that I've been developing and honing over the years is really that transmutation. How do we take our pain and turn it into something purposeful, something beautiful, something useful to other people, that isn't necessarily didactic? So it's not like I'm saying to you, this is my pain, and these are the exact reasons why, or here's what you'll learn. Like, it's not about it being educational, but it's like that process of transmutation. Here's what it can feel like. Here's how we can potentially guide ourselves through it. So as you can imagine, it was a bit of a baptism of fire. And my project was really around, I created an artist book called Mother, which explored what my mum and I went through when I was a kid, and through her alcoholism and our broken family and, all those kinds of things. And so I created this artist book that was an exploration of the post-traumatic growth. So it was looking at not so much at the trauma, but as the positive things that came out of it. And it was my way of processing and understanding who I am and where I've come from.
Yeah.
And then alongside that, the universe works in crazy ways. This is this chicken or egg thing that I was telling you about. My mum actually got really sick and then passed away in the second, or I think it was the second or third, probably it was the second year of my project. So,
oh gosh.
And it became this thing where I was living my research as I was doing it, and
wow.
it became, I became my own therapist, my own life coach, my own, mentor, alongside my supervisors who equally went through some pretty horrific things during the course of my project. And so, it's the reminder that, life has so much beautiful raw material that we can use that we don't understand, and we can use creativity as a force to understand it so that we can learn from it, right?
Yeah,
so
wow.
This is that,
like so meta, right? You're doing this PhD.
So the most meta.
Yeah, you're doing this PhD investigating creativity's impact on post-traumatic growth at the same time while you're doing a creative act of writing the book, and then also experiencing even more trauma.
I pretty much fell apart after it was done.
Oh my gosh, I can imagine. I mean, most people do just because of the sheer amount of work, let alone all these other hugely emotional impacting things throughout it.
Well, and I think back at that time, and that person that I was when I started that project is very, very different to, the iteration of myself that I am now. But, you mentioned at the start that you were leaning in for this podcast, you're leaning into that curiosity. And that's what I was doing. Something was coming up for me that was like, hey, demanding my attention. It was like, hey, we need to look at this. We need to explore this. There's something valuable here. And so what I did was I created in my external reality the systems and structures to support that exploration. And I think if we can start to think more from an inside out perspective about our lives and what we want to do and what we want to create, it becomes less about how do I fit myself and my creative voice into these things that exist in the world, and becomes more about how do I find these structures and systems and the things that already exist that are going to support the things that I'm passionate about, which is why, you see people get, leave jobs, create toxic environments, because they're trying to fit themselves into something that isn't right. But we have so much more agency when it comes to our creativity, and you'll sort of hear me talk about it in a way that might be a little bit different, because I'm really trying to separate it from the artistry, from the act of being creative. When we talk about creativity per se, my definition is that it's an organic process of connecting the dots in new and interesting ways. So it's really not about what you produce, but it's how you look and it's how you act in the world. Before you even put pen to paper, you dance or sing or whatever, like that's very, very, that's one of the byproducts of creativity, but I'm bringing it a step back rather than following down that skills and abilities and talents pathway.
Oh, I love that. I think that's a really interesting take on creativity. And I saw that on your website. Creativity isn't just art, it's how we connect the dots. And it really does speak to creativity being a mindset and not just a creative act. That's just very interesting. Like, how did you stumble across that as being your view of creativity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I've always felt this way. And it's evidence to me. I mean, obviously this stuff is easier to see when you look back because you can connect the dots easier when you can actually see the dots for what they are.
Hindsight, yeah.
And so, it's evidence to me by the fact that I never really, writing has always been, one of my biggest passions. It's not the only one. And I've always oscillated between every possible type of creative expression that you could imagine. And I love them all, just in different degrees, right? So that for me was an indication, first and foremost, that it's not really about the medium for me. It's about the process and it's about the experience and how that experience makes me feel. So when I was doing my PhD specifically, I had to come up with it. I had to define it. I had to define this thing called creativity in order to frame my research underneath it. That's part of the process, right? You got to put some parameters around your thinking so that it builds a stronger case for you throughout the course of your project. And so, I was looking at different definitions of creativity that were, more process driven, or potentially they were more outcome driven, or they were more spiritually driven. But then when I read the one about it being an organic process, particularly, and organic processes happen inside living things. And that's really a big part of the definition for me, is like it's something that we do and that is so innate to us, even on a cellular level. I mean, you could argue, we are the universe atomically. On a very, very basic level, we're made of the same stuff as the stars. What's the universe's, MO that they've figured? It's constantly expanding. It's constantly creating. That is what we are doing. We are a reflection of that, right? So connecting it to something bigger than you as well makes it, I think, takes a lot of the pressure off. I know it does for me, so that I can just play. If my job is just constant expansion, constant creation, it actually doesn't matter what I produce so long as I honor that innate urge that's within me. And so that's why I also have a Substack newsletter, which is called The Creative Urge, because oftentimes this stuff starts when we feel that that little pull, that oh, I wouldn't mind trying ceramics. Oh, I wouldn't mind cooking that recipe. Oh, I wouldn't mind, getting a new, buying a house and decorating it, so all of these are just the different ways that inner urge can potentially manifest. And in my eyes, everything is creative. Everything around us, from, the houses that we live in, to the clothes that we wear, to, the transport that we take, to the cars that we drive, are all a product of human creativity. And so, it became really clear to me that creativity wasn't just about the product. So it's not just about the product or the things that we see, but there's so much more behind it, that I think when we start to pull it apart and put it back together in ways that make sense to us on an individual level, it makes things like, starting the business, starting the podcast, having the conversation, it makes that stuff a lot easier and more accessible because we understand how we work. And that's kind of what it's about.
Yeah. That's way less daunting if you take the pressure off yourself to not say, I have to produce this particular thing, but just to allow yourself to sit within the process and explore. I think that's really interesting, because if you're putting the pressure on you to actually produce something at the end of it, you may not even start it.
Oh man, yeah. I mean, the number of conversations I have with people who are shoulda, gonna, wanna about so many different things, and it's because they're putting the cart before the horse. And so for me, whenever I try to create something, it's not so much about, I want to, sometimes it is, sometimes, you have a defined thing that you're working towards. Like, yes, I want to start the podcast, or yes, I want to start, a newsletter. Like, that's pretty defined. I think those ones where you're kind of just applying your thinking and knowledge to an already existing framework, they're easy. Like, anybody can do that stuff, because all that is just about showing up and doing the thing. However, where it gets more complicated is when what you're trying to create is more abstract, because maybe it's about something else. So maybe it's not about the outcome, but maybe it's about an idea. Maybe it's about a movement. Think about something as abstract as business. You can set up all the frameworks, you can set up all the tools, you can set up all the systems, but if you don't have a thing that you are selling, they don't really mean anything. So the things that are more abstract often trip people up faster. And this is where, particularly in that Designer Boss Summit, my presentation was all about the incubation part of the creative process, which is the part when you think about things that incubate, and the classic example is baking a cake. Of course, you get your ingredients, you get your recipe, you've got your method, you make the batter, you put it in the tin. What do you do next? You put it in the oven and you leave it. You leave it for a certain amount of time. You shouldn't be, they tell you, don't open the oven door. It's going to make it take longer. Don't poke it, don't prod it, don't add more things to it. Just let it be, and I think this is the part, because we're in late stage capitalism, it's the part of the equation that people don't want to do, because it's the part where you have to do nothing. You have to just trust. You have to be, and you have to trust, and you have to leave things alone. Like, I swear, like, so many things go unfinished because people won't wait another day or another week to just let it develop. They try to rush it, and they hate it, and so they just drop it, or they just don't finish it at all because they're like, this is taking too long. So there's an element, yes, at the start, and so in different parts of the process, yes, at the start, be energetic, have that vibe, that push, that hustle to get things started. But once it's started, once it's open, once it's happening, like, take a few steps back and just let it be. Take a moment to see what's trying to come out. We don't have to control every part of the process. In fact, if you try to control every part of the process, you're going to end up burning out. Like, that's the fast track to burnout if you try to keep a hold of everything. So I think that there's this beautiful push and pull between active creation and passive creation. So those moments when we should lean in, when we should push, and then those moments when we need to retreat, because we're in this for a marathon. It's a marathon, not a sprint, and we're in this for the long haul. Like, I want to be creating stuff till the day I die. So I know now that it's okay to just let something simmer or let something bake. And while you're doing that, and this is the best part of it, you can go work on something else. There's always something else to do.
Hey, there you go. I do think that is probably why a lot of people are afraid to jump into creativity, because we have this kind of expectation that you do everything only if you're good at it. And so just going out there and just trying different ways, exploring different forms of creativity for yourself, and not necessarily nailing it, not being like the best at it, is very confronting for people. But I think what you're saying there about kind of being passive, sometimes you just got to be sitting in that journey, and you're not going to be sprinting ahead. Yeah, it's a marathon. You might even be doing it walking pace or crawling pace, but you're still moving.
Absolutely. Because this is the thing, like, the creative process, it's not a linear thing. It's a quantum experience. You are in every single phase of the creative process at all times. Some just need more attention or, more love than others. And they'll come into frame, they'll recede back when you've given them what they need. And the thing is, like, and this is why I made that comment around late stage capitalism, because we forget that the capitalist imperative is production. Like, that is the highest goal of production: faster, more efficient, cheaper, and volume, right? That is not what our MO is as humans, right? The things that allow us to flourish are rest. It's connection, it's experience, it's emotion, So not everything that you create needs to be sold. And that's another conversation I have with people all the time. Like, not everything needs to be monetized. You can just keep it for yourself. And not everything needs to be shared, like, so many people, particularly what I see with commercial creatives. So they're our designers, developers, copywriters, anybody who works in a job, marketers, small business owners, entrepreneurs, anyone works in a job where they're trading their creativity for money. they often burn out the most when they have given too much of themselves away. And I am totally guilty of this, and it happens to me all the time, because they forget that they've got to put stuff back in creatively. And I'm not talking in terms of like just having a holiday or meditating or having a nap, but you have to create something that's personally meaning for you, because that personal fuel is what's going to drive everything else. Again, coming back to that inside out approach, like being more creative in the external world is not going to fill our cup in the same way that it would somebody who doesn't work in a creative job. So there are differences and nuances here between, what kinds of creative activities we should do and try and stick with, depending on, where creativity sits in our own personal ecosystem. If it is my job, oh my God, like I do not want to have the pressure of being a master ceramicist. That would stress me. It would just stress me out. However, one of the things I love doing is just coloring in a coloring book. Like the amount of joy that brings me. Does anybody need to see that shit? No, like it's like useless. It doesn't do anything for anybody else except it makes me really happy. So I think that's part of it too, is understanding that, yes, you don't have to be a master. You don't even have to be a beginner. You could just have it be something that's behind closed doors that just gives you some time to express yourself. Because in essence, that's what creativity, from a human perspective, that's what it's there for. It's allowing us to release some of that emotional tension, to get out what we need to get out, that what's trying to come out, what we need to get out, to clear our insides, to make them a little bit more calm, collected, grounded, that kind of stuff.
Is that why you were linking creativity to, I think you called it the antidote to trauma? Is that like?
Oh, yeah. Just as I pretty much, I've got like a one-liner that's like, creativity is the antidote. It's like, it's the poison and the antidote, right? So, it's such an interesting paradox, because especially for people who work in creative jobs, oftentimes the last thing you want to do is, create something else for someone else. So what I sort of say is like 30 minutes a day, that is just for you. Like it's not about producing. It's not about like, oh, I'm going to write a book. It's not about anything that has a defined ending or outcome. It is about a practice. And this is, so I use this analogy quite a bit, of an iceberg analogy. And I think a lot of other people do as well in different industries. But for me, like if we think about an iceberg, you have a little bit at the tip that's out of the water that everybody can see. That's the creative product. So that's the website, it's the painting, it's the dance, it's the movie, whatever. You go below the surface, and that's where the biggest part of the iceberg is, that chunky middle bit. That's the process. So it's just behind the product. It's basically what you go through to produce the product. But the part of creativity that I think is the most underserved and the most underutilized is right at the very, very bottom of the iceberg. It's kind of like it's the thing. It's like what do you call that? The what is that thing called? The core, not really the core.
Like a tail.
Yeah. Or it's like the thing that everything else kind of pivots on. It's got a word. Classic copywriter brain. Words sometimes escape me. Yeah. But it's like the magnet that everything else pivots off. At the very, very bottom of the iceberg, it's in the deepest, coldest, harshest water. It's the creative practice. So people often don't talk about, I mean, artists do a lot. And this is where I think that when we need to rally and get behind and lift up our artists, because they lead with practice. For them, if they do not practice their creativity every day, everything is wrong. Whereas for everybody else, the practice of creativity is often the most unnerving, because it's like, well, what do I produce? What do I have at the end of it? Where's my reward? Because that's how we're trained. So when I say 30 minutes a day of tapping into your own creativity, that's what it's about. It's like, what can I do that I can just experience that allows me on a small scale to play, to move around, to connect some dots together. And some of my favorite activities for that, coloring in, as I mentioned before, is a brilliant one. Even just like drawing, doing a puzzle, cooking is amazing. I tend to err away from the more wellness activities, even though I think they are very creative. But again, they kind of have their own defined outcomes. So it's more things that, particularly things that you can do with your hands that pull you off a screen. And it's so good for your brain and for your mental health and for your nervous system. To have that experience in little bite-sized chunks every week, because that's the other part, right, is that people are like, I'm going to be creative. And so, they'll go to their calendar and they'll block out 4 hours on a Saturday, and then they wonder why they never show up for it. Because it's too much. It's too much. It has to be the lowest possible bar for us every day to build up the habit of creativity. Practice. Call it what you will. But yeah, so I think that's, if we can start to, from an inside out perspective, think about what are the things that I like to do? What are the things that bring me joy? It could be jewelry making. It could be, hand modeling clay, anything, it just is a completely different way of experiencing life.
Yeah, it's true. And it is a step-by-step sort of thing. You can't just fully jump in and expect to be a champion swimmer. You got to dip your toes in the water first. And so, like, with this being such a sort of a creativity being a healing process and a growth process, do you think that we are going to start seeing this being prescribed to people as a part of a treatment, or do you think that is just too far?
No. We've been doing that for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. If we look at even some of our first, some of the first inhabitants of this country, their art and creativity and self-expression were woven into their storytelling from day dot, right? And even in some other cultures, you go to the shaman and, you'd say, I'm feeling this way. And they'd be like, okay, like go and paint this brick for 4 days, So I think there's been so many different examples of it across time. And, there is a whole, particularly for trauma treatment, there's the whole field of art therapy, which if you're in crisis, is an incredibly beautiful thing and gift that you can give to yourself. That purely focuses on the practice. It's not about you're not training to be an artist, but you're using art in a therapeutic way. And I've definitely done a lot of reading and research, and I've got a few friends who are in the field, and it's it's not as popular as it should be. But I think that naturally, when capitalism is dipping towards creativity as being the biggest money winner, as we're seeing now and we have been seeing over the last sort of 5 to 10 years with the creator economy, there has to be tools and systems and support that builds up around that. And we saw it with the wellness industry before that. So I think it's only going to become an even more important conversation as our understanding of the human brain continues to evolve, as the conversation around mental health continues to expand and broaden, and become, a lot more human. I think people, and I think everyone's, even if we look back, and this is my favorite example of this, if we look back to the pandemic when we're in lockdown, what did everybody do? Their first instinct, it wasn't to work more. It was like, let's bake bread.
Yes.
Let's upcycle furniture. Let's knit. So I think the part of the problem with creativity is that because it's so innate and it's so deep within us, it gets taken for granted. It gets taken for granted in every way imaginable. And again, that's part of that whole conversation around creativity is the antidote, because it's there, it's within us. It's just, it never goes away. It doesn't dry up. It's just chills. It's chilling there until you need it, really.
It's kind of almost on demand. We just need to know how to tap into it.
Absolutely. And everybody has their own way of doing that. I believe based on your life experience, for me, like my creativity is very much wired to challenge and growth and trauma. So if something challenging happens, the first thing I do is I go into creation mode. The first question I ask myself when shit goes down is, what can I make of this? It's the very first question. For other people, it might be when they're really happy. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm having the best time. How do I express this? And then they leap to the canvas. So I think it's about figuring out with what's going on in your life. What are the kind of conversations that are happening in your head that could potentially be a creative moment? When you find yourself, maybe it's, maybe you struggle with conflict and there's a conversation that you need to have with someone, but you're really scared to have it. It's like, could that be a creative moment? Could me and this person go and do a life drawing class and we talk while we're painting, So we can use creativity as a vehicle for difficult things. And I guess that's kind of what my the tagline of my life is that, creativity isn't just about what we do, how we do it, but it's also like how we are, because this is our lives. This is our creative life, and it is about what you want to do with it.
Wow. And that really kind of things back to what you said before, is like, there's no right or wrong way for it, whether it comes out of happiness or from the deepest depths of sorrow, however it expresses, that's, or wherever it comes from, is still fine.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's no, there's no one way for any of this or for anything really, and I think the quicker you can wrap your head around that, the fact that there is more than one way to do anything, the easier it becomes to find your own path through it. Because that's it, right? Creativity is for you. It's not for your boss. It's not for your partner. It's not for your kids. I mean, everybody can have it. It's not something that is a finite resource like time or money. Creativity is a quantum resource. It is constantly expanding, and your job is to figure out A, how to tap into it, and then B, what do you want to do with it when you've got it? They're the two questions.
Oh, love that. I love the fact that it's expansive and it will just continue growing. There's never going to be a limit to it.
No, it was here before us. It's going to be here after us.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, wow. That's amazing. Marion, I feel like I could talk to you. There's so many other things that are in my brain. I'm going to have to invite you back.
I would love that. This is the conversation of our lives, people. Never stop. Never stop.
Never stop. I'll have to sort of condense my ideas a little bit more, because I feel like I could talk to you for like another 24 hours straight. But thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you giving me the time.
Oh, you're so welcome. Honestly, like I take my hat off to you for creating or kind of opening up a gap for this conversation to flourish and to continue. Because it's people like you and people like me that we are so passionate about what this concept can do and its power. This is how you change stuff, right? So the more airtime we can give creativity, the better in my eyes.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think that this conversation definitely would have sparked a few ideas in the listeners, especially around how you can use your life experiences to help fuel your creativity. So I want to say thank you so much to everyone who has tuned in to listen to Creativity Uncovered today. I hope that what we've spoken about today helps you summon your creativity the next time that you need it. If you've made it this far, a huge thank you for your support and tuning into today's episode. Creativity Uncovered has been lovingly recorded on the land of the Cubby Cubby people, and we pay our respect to elders past, present, and emerging. This podcast has been produced by my amazing team here at Crisp Communications, and the music you just heard was composed by James Gatling. If you liked this episode, please do share it around and help us on our mission to unlock more creativity in this world. You can also hit subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episode releases.